Before I actually begin, let me explain even why I'm here, because I'm not supposed to be here at this time. At least the third time now, I've had to break my general rule of thumb, which is I never speak down to two events, just like I never publish in the journal.
This is a really bad rule of thumb.
It may be, yes.
Want to hear from you?
Other people have said the same, but
Okay.
no one's yet made a convincing argument. But one of the other members of the original collective and the contributor to the first of the Pink issues, Dan O'Hara, was supposed to be part of this program. And in fact, I believe when Don first drafted it, Dan's name was there. But Dan's health particularly makes it impossible for him, extremely difficult to travel. So Don said to me, yes, you should do it. But we didn't know what the it was that I should do. And I didn't panic immediately because I thought to myself, well, I have this monstrous manuscript for Lindsay Waters, which is sitting on my desk. Surely somewhere in there are 15 pages. It turns out that's not true. So I tried to cobble together bits and pieces to make a little paper on Wallace Stevens. And what I produced was a discussion of Stevens's great poem, great but still minor poem, Credences of Summer, for 7 or 8 pages, and then I appended to it a few pages discussing the often aforementioned Frank Kermode. But I decided that wasn't very good, although I think each of the 2 pieces is okay. So I'm not going to do that, if that's okay. And instead I'm going to pick up the other major figure, one of the other 2 major figures from this book. The book, in a sense, has 3 major figures in it. Wally Stevens, well, yes, conceptually 3 major figures: Wallace Stevens, Theodore Adorno, and Walter Benjamin, although it also has chapters on Rembrandt and Shakespeare, who can't usually be thought of as minor figures. There are Jonathan was very kind and generous to spend a long time with me yesterday talking about the most difficult part of this book for me to write, which is the first chapter, because I don't like it. But the more I thought about our conversation afterwards, and it's related to things I had thought about before, the more I realized that the problem with this book is not that I'm thinking about it in the wrong way. I've been thinking about it as an essay, in the spirit of Adorno's great essay, what is an essay, followed by Said's essay, or Adorno's essay, what is an essay? And instead of thinking about it as an essay at all, I should instead really return to some of my childhood formulations and think about this kind of thing as a work of music. It stands better for me in that sense, and so I can speak of things like motifs. So one of the important defining motifs of this book, which on some level looks like a defense not of poetry but of poesis over a long history and wide geographical spread of not only the term but of everything that, as we've seen in all the papers presented here for 2 days, can be included under the term poesis or poesia and any of its variations, poesie, poetry, and so on and so forth. The dance. I'm trying to think about the relationship between writing a defensive poesis, which means, as far as I'm concerned, writing an account of poesis, which is a foundationally secular project. So one of the counterpoints to me of poesis, one of the threats to poesis has been and I use the word now in a relatively strict sense, the modern critical adoption of a rhetoric of redemption. Which appears in many different forms as as a modality for recovering and also covering over the possibility and so-called impoverishment of human poetic activity on the grounds that it, like the human itself, I here refer to Tony Bose, is caught up in finitude. So there are many things going on here, and I'm going to just cut into the middle by picking up one particular motif, and I'm sorry for that long introduction. So I'm going to speak to you about Walter Benjamin in order, as I said to Lindsay Waters, to help promote the sale by Harvard University Press of books in Walter Benjamin translation. The opening sentence, and perhaps given what I've said, will make a little sense to you. I think it's a daring claim. Benjamin made redemption the compelling intellectual and political project. Full stop. Redemption does not return a lost deity or wonder to a fallen world, because always and already, and I quote, the presence of the Messianic force, end quote, has, lots of small quotations here, has redeemed history. This has been, always and already, the presence of the Messianic force has redeemed history. I will speak to the point that the idea of the Messianic force is a mistake, the consequences of which have been dire. I'm trying in an indirect way to make a connection to Buttigieg's thought from yesterday about Lorianism, but in a less outrageous sense. Redemption is an active process. Now, paraphrasing and speaking on the topic from Benjamin's point of view. Redemption is an active process, and for Benjamin, it is always a political act. Yet redemption is secondary by nature, always resting on the nexus, and if you've read Benjamin, you know these terms, resting on the nexus of ruin, belatedness, and melancholy. Intellectual, political, and destructive, it smashes open closed spaces to, and I quote again, reveal itself as messianic, end quote. The messianic is the act in history that opens and keeps open a space. It could be trauma, it could be flashback. Messianism. Most important, it reveals its own quality as redemption, always at work in human time. Benjamin puts it this way at the end of his life. And I quote, "For the revolutionary thinker, the peculiar revolutionary chance offered by every historical moment gets its warrant from the political situation, but it is equally grounded for this thinker in the right of entry which the historical moment enjoys vis-a-vis a quite distinct chamber of the past, one which up to that point has been closed and locked." So that's the end of the quotation from Benjamin in 1940. Long before this, Benjamin had long before this left behind the positivist revolutionaries who thought of classless society as the end of revolution and of historical development. They could no more achieve a, quote, redeemed humanity than those social democrats who delighted in an endlessly deferred revolutionary transformation, so they could dwell forever in what Benjamin calls the anteroom of emergent, quote, revolutionary situations with more or less equanimity. Benjamin accomplished many great things, but among the most important is his analysis of time as a topic peculiar to history. In discussing revolution, for example, he notes that, and I quote again, social democrats conceive history teleologically, postulating the classless society as the political human goal. In so doing, however, they defer the achievement of that goal indefinitely, perhaps infinitely, conceiving history in terms of a stable denominator such as culture or class, and so smoothing away loose strands. Like any positivist and like all counter-revolutionaries who theorize history as progress, these social democrats' concepts of history rest upon an a priori and obscured sense of time as what Benjamin refers to as empty and homogeneous. Conventional history of ideas, then, might place Benjamin's insight within the early 20th century left schism over voluntarism and determinism, about which we've heard much in the last 2 days, particularly around the issues of spontaneity, organization, and the mass strike. More important than such contextualization, however, and in fact I will insist in the entire book that contextualization is a bad thing. More important than such contextualization, however, is Benjamin's profound rhetorical and figural presentation of the human consequences of such notions of time and history. Dialectically, such notions precede the operations of social democrats. I say dialectically because we're thinking with Benjamin here, and others whose, quote, worldview, that's his term, emerges in the deferral of a fantasized telos. These notions, equally dialectically, of course, once established within institutional reason of state and party, materialize smooth history and empty homogeneous time successfully over and against what Benjamin calls the moment of humanity. While Benjamin asserts that political activity can break into this smoothed space and so reveal itself, quote again, as messianic, not surprisingly, he also theorizes an intellectual figure in practice able to legitimate the messianic nature of history as that which destructive political activity reveals. Benjamin read and admired Lukash's History and Class Consciousness, a fact much discussed by scholars interested in Judaism, Messianism, Marxism, and the European political left in the 20th century. I have a footnote here with a long list of references. The conclusion of Benjamin's essay, Surrealism, not much discussed essay, shows Benjamin's willingness to join Lukash's thinking on the leadership of the vanguard, even if Benjamin recasts that notion in terms closer to the intellectual and aesthetic work of Surrealism, which is to say in terms of desire. In 1940, as Benjamin deepens his theory of history, he extends the task of the intellectual in a new and specific way. The intellectual emerges as what he calls, his phrase now, a historical materialist. The condition of whose possibility is the very, what we've come to call, secular messianism of history, obscure to the normative emergence of institutionalized knowledge and practice. So here you have a kind of moment of coalition with Adorno's general critique of the academy as the place where the schema of official culture resides. Yes? This is Benjamin now, still in 1940. The historical materialist determines the presence of a messianic force in history. The key word here, of course, is determine. We have to get to that word. Benjamin's thought rarely moves far from the metaphorics of technology and science, as you know. In Paralipomena, he analogizes the materialist historian to the analytic physicist, suggesting that the investigation of the structure of history is like a scientist's spectrum analysis, his phrase. He extends this analogy in a most interesting way, embodying a mode of thought still recognizably derived from the characteristics Auerbach notes in the Eloist style earlier in the book manuscript, I think at the beginning of the second chapter. I discuss Auerbach's moment in Auerbach's mimesis in the first chapter, not the comparison between Homer and the Bible, but the moment where Auerbach says that the monotheistic Jewish God is the stylistic expression of a tribal sensitivity. I'm saying that he, in extending the technical vocabulary, he, Benjamin, still is embodying a mode of thought recognizably derived from the characteristics that Auerbach notes in the Eloist style. Happy to talk more about that later. Benjamin chooses a physicist whose task is to discover instrumentally the presence of, quote, ultraviolet light in the solar spectrum. No doubt Benjamin was aware of the intense work by physicists on the problems of cosmic rays and so on and so forth. We skip past this pretty quickly. What interested him was the failure of physicists to solve their problem, to produce the definite knowledge they sought. The failure is an important part of his analogy. For Benjamin, the failure takes a specific form. Physicists could identify ultraviolet light's presence in the spectrum, but by nature and definition could not, and I quote, know the color of ultraviolet light. It's a very interesting phrase. Materialist historians similarly can know the presence of the messianic in history and time, but do not know what it looks like and cannot. Focus on the limit of knowledge is tempting, and we must return to it. But the limited success of investigation matters more. Isn't it interesting how we keep talking about failure? Benjamin's political intellectual task is to reveal and assure the being of messianic time, or more precisely, still quoting from 1940, what he calls the presence of the messianic force in history. Humans cannot see ultraviolet light. The work of experts with precise instruments assures their existence, and in so doing enhances and stabilizes the theoretical framework of the discipline, gaining authority, this is the Eloism, from the practical disclosure and the consistency of theorizing. Realism and nominalism return as critical categories now from philosophies long gone by. Yet, for the dialectician, there is a legitimate question resulting from the application of technical knowledge, mathematics, and high theory to prove the existence of the insensible. The question is not a weak nominalist one, not one familiar to academics in recent years from the work of neo-pragmatists committed to weak knowledge. Rather, simply the question would be, why now? Or, why in a certain moment, and what, if any, work of reason or labor or other force emerges in the moments of such determination? Again, back to that word. Benjamin insists that history, quote, deals with the arbitrarily elaborated causal chains, end quote. This is his first gestural movement against history. A fundamental weakness and error. This is a fundamental weakness and error that emerges from positivism, even when disguised as weak knowledge or anti-foundationalism. So you see, Vatima and Rorty are not welcome in this discussion. In any such form, history results from a simple equation that has an arbitrarily determined constant as its divisor, or, again, quoting him, divisor or common denominator. Culture, enlightenment, the objective spirit, or, he says, whatever one wants to call that divisor. Physicists have instruments as well as theories to determine their results. Normative history, by contrast, has its equations, and we now must say its algorithms, for searching the nearly infinite pool of citations from which historians make connections and chains, raveling the surface of historical knowledge. Benjamin's theory produces the instruments needed to determine the presence of the Messianic in history. This is the goal. Constellation, these are key terms, right, of method and concept. Constellation and dialectical image are the analogies to spectrum analyzers in physics. Constellations differ from connections made by historians operating within the assumed but unproved and in fact erroneous model of smooth history and empty time. Connections depend upon what he calls arbitrarily elaborated causal chains, themselves the operators of common denominators, that is, forms of positivism. That positivism arrests time and history, bringing each moment to a standstill. Indeed, such positivism places the moments of humanity within the arbitrary. History places those connected moments within what he calls, this wonderful phrase, arbitrarily elaborated causal chains. So history places connected moments within arbitrarily elaborated causal chains. So despite, in a sense, my disagreement with Benjamin in certain things, I will stand in part on that argument when I make later claims about why I'm not interested in contextualization. Such historicality corresponds perfectly with the smooth, empty, homogeneous time of non-revolutionary politics. Together, they obscure and deny the active existence of the secular Messianic in time, an otherwise invisible quality emergent perhaps in political action, but knowable only through intellectual analysis. Benjamin provides the instruments, he believes, needed to counterpoint the arbitrary, elaborated causal chains of connection that make up the non-revolutionary politics of empty time. As we saw, well, if you had read the earlier chapters, you would have seen in his essay on surrealism, empty time corresponds to despair, to hopelessness, consequent upon the impossible alternatives of progress and myth or eternal return. We might say that ontologically, if you want to use the word, time and history are always already redeemed for Benjamin, since they always already host the Messianic force. How are we to disclose this force and so legitimate another politics, another history, and another time? I'm trying to read sympathetically as much as possible, right? How are we to arm the intellectual class, certain of this Messianic force, for its revelation and the consequent redemption? Benjamin puts it this way again in 1940, and I quote, "A genuinely Messianic face must be, remember in the Trauerspiel book, the importance of the skull vis-a-vis the face. So a genuinely Messianic face must be restored to the concept of classless society, and to be sure, in the interest of furthering the revolutionary politics of the proletariat itself." End of quotation. So while Benjamin speaks of these matters in terms of the movement of concepts, specific forms of intellectual activity inhere in the movement. The movement and burden of concepts is very much an issue in the materials I am considering. This is part of the elaboration to the passage, Jonathan, in talking about the unanticipated burden of the created consequences. Adorno's thinking on the essay form is itself a way of thinking the nature of the concept as movement and arrest. Were we able to extend the issue, a contrast of Benjamin with his junior contemporary Georges Canguilhem would be enlightening. Benjamin poses a version of this problem for us. Quote him again. This is still 1940. Since history affords an idea of the fundamental citability of its object, this object must present itself in its ultimate form as the moment of humanity. And in this moment, he continues, time must be brought to a standstill. End quote. Famous passage. So we ask, how is this object to present itself? This how, this is a bad question. The how is purely instrumental for the moment. Surely in mundane terms, as is perhaps true of all idealist-influenced ways of speaking, the object can only, quote, give itself, end quote, through the active presence of an intellect able to perceive what is nominally given by the object in itself. How should we or could we receive this gift? Theoretically, reception depends upon an account of, firstly, the necessity of such givenness. And we have that here. And secondly, it depends upon the preparation of an intellect that can receive the gift. Because you see, really the question here is, how do you create the Messianic materialist intellectual? Or how do you generate the Gnostic priestly wisdom that can otherwise see the invisible? Yes? It depends upon the preparation of an intellect that can receive the gift, a reception legitimated by an instrument that uniquely perceives and so proves the existence of what is given, and importantly, thereby assures its own legitimacy. This methodological circularity leads the intellectual to uncovering, so we're told, what is given. In this case, as in others of this type, others in the book, the uncovering of the given depends nominally upon the given itself. I quote him again from 1940. Extremely famous and very productive and generative passage. You'll recognize it. The dialectical image, yes, is an occurrence of ball lightning, Kugelblitz, that runs across the whole horizon of the past. Okay, so Nietzsche had already famously exposited the grammatical instability of lightning, as we say in English, in the Germanic languages, making the verbal power of a gerund clear to all. Benjamin's style draws out the grammatical potentiality of Kugelblitz so that it can run, he says, laufen, läuft, intransitively across the horizon of bygone days, horizontes vergangen, right? Mundanely, then, Benjamin invents the figure of the dialectical image, but posits it metaphorically as a natural rarity, the quality of which is its grammatical status midway between verb and noun. Effectively, this positioning of the dialectical image seeks for its authority as a given, as that which inheres in the conceptual given that its existence verifies. Yet it is purely an intellectual and rhetorical invention. You might even say it's a grammatical, or you could quote Guytrud as a grammatological invention, right? With its status midway between, an intellectual and rhetorical invention, an instrument newly available to conduct what he calls spectrum analysis, which is required to show the presence of the Messianic force. Benjamin's invention is remarkably clever, and it's been immensely productive, suggesting as it does that the instrumental apprehension of the Messianic truth results from the blitz of the instrument itself. If rays appear to physicists because of their instruments, critical intellectuals will have it better, as their grail, the Messianic force, provides the instrument in and through which its own existence appears. The Messianic force and the Kugelblitz are much more imminent than the spectral analyzers and ultraviolet light. Nonetheless, in each case, the materialist seeks determinate knowledge. He calls here Feststellen, a process that discovers and determines simultaneously, that is, identifies, separates out, and measures. If we recall how Paul Klee's, remember the famous painting that dominates the ending of the 1940 notebooks, if we recall how Paul Klee's Angelus Novus, proper counterpoint to which is Simberg's painting of the angels, if we recall how Paul Klee's Angelus Novus stares at accumulating ruined history, then we see the redemptive force of the dialectical image that not only unearths the messianic force obscured even to, or perhaps especially to, the angelic mind, but in so doing tosses aside the conventional divisions of past and present. Connection, Zusammenhängen, and constellation, Konstellation, are very different concepts. Connection belongs in a discussion of causality. In connection, things hang together or depend upon each other in contiguous ways. Constellation extends rhetorically the root determinant of Feststellen, and metaphorically perfects the image of the Kugelblitz starring the sky's horizon. You can hear in the background of this some of the long written pages on the auroras of autumn. Given that history deals with connections, as Benjamin writes, within whatever dependencies it models for itself. Remember all of those divisors, culture and so on and so forth. Or as Don calls it, the unspoken darkness of the consensus, right? Within whatever dependencies it models for itself, the result can be only linked moments which might stand out. Benjamin says, the object must present itself. We must keep in mind that in non-revolutionary moments in politics, time is empty and homogeneous, like ours. Such moments, strictly speaking, are not historical moments at all, in Benjamin's sense. Historical knowledge that determines the presence of the messianic force takes the form of a constellation that itself requires the existence of two moments. Most important is the first moment, the determining condition of such knowledge. The moment become historical. The social democrats, intellectual contextualizers, all, and all others who smooth an empty time, dehistoricize all moments. Historical redemption, Benjamin, requires an antagonistic relation to such forces and institutions. We should recall Sholem and Benjamin's commitment to a destructive aesthetics. We should also recall Benjamin's, to go back a bit now, Benjamin's admiration for Lukács's history and class consciousness. So we might keep in mind the important place assigned to vanguard intellectuals of a different kind, admittedly, in Benjamin than in Lukács, in the production of non-contextualizing historical consciousness. Benjamin's thinking has had considerable influence among those I will call progressive critical intellectuals and deep thinkers about the political cultural fate of the species, because he, Benjamin, is a successful exemplar for such intellectuals and thinkers. Indeed, not only Benjamin's pathos-ridden heroic practice and life example, but also his rigorous account of the exemplary intellectual's historical necessity leaves a unique heritage for generations of heirs. We should keep clearly in mind, however, how this Benjaminian construct Benjaminian construct effectively imbues the intellectual, the materialist historian, with the messianic force in a way that surprisingly echoes Hegel. The messianic force seems to come to consciousness, as it were, in the messianic figure. Quote again, a genuinely messianic face, remember this passage, must be restored to the concept of classless society, and to be sure, in the interest of furthering the revolutionary politics of the proletariat itself. If political activity forces open the antechambers of empty and homogeneous time as evidence of messianic force, interpretively, the messianic intellectual alone can call any act messianic that is properly political. Right? That's the Eloistic position consequent upon the invention of God. What goes along with the invention of God, a priestly class, so to speak. The Messianic intellectual, then heir to the Eloist, as Auerbach helps us understand the consequences of the Eloist's style, acquires the authoritative interpretive mantle of a long tradition. Sholem and Benjamin had debated Kafka in part because each saw in Kafka's writings the imagined truth of lost book and lost tradition, of lost authority and lost community. The word really does resonate through their correspondence. Benjamin's postulation of the Messianic force in history, no matter how secularized, I put that word in quotations, is the individual's imaginative effort to redeem history, in prose, as strands made of the moments of humanity. Success in such a project must move on two tracks together, with the practice of the intellectual confirming the vision of Messianic force, and the revelatory emergence of the Messianic force legitimating the very being of that intellectual, here called historical materialist, but better called the Messianic intellectual. We have a word for this. We call this the vicious circle, right? Such a double success flows from Benjamin's extraordinary conceptual and figural imagination, from his ability to prose out the very notion of the flashing image and its results. Indeed, the articulate prosed results matter more than the flashing image, perhaps despite the amount of commentary expended on the dialectical image. Constellations flash into being thanks to the brilliance of the dialectical image. We see the structure of those constellations. Seen in this way, they require two moments: a present moment of humanity, quote, brought to a standstill, and a second moment, too easily called a past moment, equally still, but seen from that which we call a present moment as historical, knowable only through the lens of contemporaneity. We must keep in mind the opening intent of Benjamin's very important paragraph on the dialectical image's effective value. Readers, of course, find themselves drawn to the content of the image made concept. But in a prior and perhaps more fundamental sense, we must see that Benjamin's motive is to define what it, quote, means, end quote, to articulate a constellation's nature and specificity. And here is the famous passage. Articulating the past historically means, just the image, articulating the past historically means recognizing those elements of the past which come together in the constellation of a single moment. Historical knowledge is possible only within the historical moment. But knowledge within the historical moment is always already knowledge of a moment. In drawing itself together in the moment, in the dialectical image, the past becomes part of humanity's involuntary memory. Just, I think, a version of your paper, right?
I got it.
Structurally, these moments articulate themselves. That's the end of the quotation. Structurally, then, these moments articulate themselves upon each other, forming this. Have you ever seen Jasper Jones's palimpsest? That's a good visualization, I think it is. Structurally, these moments articulate themselves upon each other, forming the citable archive of memory. Yet knowledge of these moments, and this very theory of their existence, of their place within an order of knowledge and understanding, have two prerequisites. Again, the instruments and their masters. The great exchange, and this is a great exchange, between Sholem and Benjamin on Kafka shows us how deeply they worried about the loss of tradition, the inconceivability of Europe without Jews, and the effects of modernity upon the book. They accepted in different ways the need for new paths to redemption. Superficially, we could talk about biographies for that. Superficially, Benjamin seems to have cobbled together a metaphor from his study of Proust with a political notion of intellectual leadership associated with Lukács and perhaps Lenin, to arrive at an overcoming of the great alienation at the heart of Europe and European modernity between the wars just prior to and beginning with the time of Nazism. In a moment of extraordinary political crisis, eventuating in barbarism and genocide, Benjamin's accomplishment and gift to his successors acquires an aura of potentiality his legatees embrace, perhaps with some joyous desperation. As I suggested in the first chapter, which we haven't seen, the originary power of Benjamin's legacy drew certain later critics into explicit battles over the value of his remains. For the most part, however, such battles, inconsequential as they are, make clear that Benjamin exists for us as a source, as an originary figure about whose legacy we can but stage endless debates, precisely, as it were, on the model of the Eloist's style. Our aim always will be to clarify the meaning of the great original, or perhaps to set it somewhat aside to make room for other lines. Yet, as I've suggested above, the second mode tends to be mere family quarrel. So let me see if I can have a tentative ending in a second. Small conclusions. I am suggesting that we turn our eyes to two relatively transparent goals in Benjamin's late notes and see their links: to articulate and to redeem. These are the aims of this grand intellectual project. Articulate is not perhaps the right word here. But I need a marker, so I'll use it. Essential conceptually is the very idea of messianism, a notion that many believe gains some special effect by its opposed secularization. In this case, by making the messianic force the specific political and intellectual double moment of humans' active and evident and stilled moments of history. The intellectual, the theorist, who articulates this force in this complex historical overlay, history as palimpsest, plays an essential role. The messianic intellectual makes the overlaid moments of past bygones into the archive of involuntary memory, because political action alone does not know history or humanity. This is what I was thinking of when I was listening to your paper yesterday. The knowledge and judgment represented by the technical skill of the scientific messianist creates, quote, humanity's involuntary memory. There's the Proust, right? How so? Benjamin provides this own summary answer. The dialectical image can be defined as the involuntary memory of redeemed humanity. Does that answer the how so? No. The messianic intellectual has an essential and unique creative role in relation to the dialectical image in Benjamin. Structurally, moments articulate themselves upon each other, yet prose articulation requires the interpreter, the knower, so we're back to the special form. It requires the interpreter, the knower, the figure of judgment who can see the constellation, allowing the past to become part of humanity's memory. Here, presumably, is the goal, the repair of the Kafkaesque disaster. It leaves a powerful and valuable legacy. We are now always already redeemed. And this knowledge gives Benjamin's intellectual heirs the thought to be necessary legitimacy to practice a destructive aesthetic, to extend his process of redemption by building or recalling the archive of involuntary memory of redeemed humanity. Practically speaking, finally, this returns us to the dominance, this is the overarching motif of this book, this returns us to the dominance of allegoresis, that is to say, the making allegory of everything, which is a rhetorical structure and gesture as old as Quintilian and Socrates, but depends in the modern world precisely upon the Benjaminian presupposition of the angel that all is ruling. This returns us to the dominance of allegoresis, to the rhetoric of ruling, and the structures of kenosis elsewhere in the book on Gnosticism, which I've already discussed. Now I ask, why and how so? Simply because without the theory that testifies to the messianic force, to the combination of political activity and its intellectual corollary, the archive of involuntary memory would not exist. And humanity's redemption is a nemo. The Benjaminian legacy commits us to the hard and persistent work of keeping the archive open. You can see this, right, for 2 days. Of creating it in turn, and above all, in assuming the need for redemption, which, remember, is guaranteed. Indeed, it assumes that redemption is the category of figure appropriate to, by that I mean that best appropriates, the state of humanity and history, or appropriate to human lives in various moments of time and place. Ironically, of course, Benjamin's creativity settled firmly into the crises of Europe and Euro-American modernity, settled firmly into that crisis, theorizes on an historical model of internal formation. Past moments as part of present moments within an inheritance. Again, of course, his heirs have diversified, I'm going to end with this paragraph, and universalized this ambition, extending the redemption to all areas of global economy and struggles with global culture. In other words, no charge of racism or Orientalism, my timer, no charge of racism or Orientalism easily stands against the Benjaminian accomplishment or the romance that his heirs have inherited. Anyway, thank you. I used your extra 10 seconds yesterday from yesterday wrong.
Where do you give it? Well used.
Yeah.
I've heard iterations of this paper, I guess, for a while.
You have?
When you came to Temple several
Talked
years
about
ago,
Harold Bloom.
and Benjamin, you presented the painting of the angels.
Oh, that, yes, there's two separate
And
businesses.
it's always left me very, it's left me lots of questions that have led me to return to Benjamin's, thinking about your arguments. Is there another, your discussion of the rhetoric of redemption, is there another kind of redemption? And I want you to put this in the context of Stevens, or how you see him as a kind of alternative. I'll stop there.
There's another chapter which opens with the actual parallel line for Wallace Stevens' imagination requiring no redemption. So I'm not only trying to make a positive statement of fact, but I'm also trying to erase the term from the place which it's had ever since, if we speak colloquially, ever since Meyer Abrams' natural supernaturalism kind of surfaced things for what we might call ordinary scholars in English. Right. So one of the incidental things I'm trying to do is break that. I don't think there's any category of redemption in Stevens. My whole point, of course, here, to put it simply, is poiesis is prior to, outside, more foundational than the strongest forces which exist in a competing tradition that is very old. And that tradition fundamentally derogates poiesis as, simply put, the human species project of creating the world. I don't mean now the earth, but creating the world as the fulfilled image of its own dream. There's this remarkable moment in Northrop Frye. People will perhaps remember him. There's this remarkable moment in Northrop Frye where he is trying to make a distinction between anagogies and allegory. And like Jameson later trying to reread the fourfold model of interpretation in Dante. And I can't quote, I'm sorry, I cannot quote Frye exactly, although I'm embarrassed that I can't. But his argument is that for Dante, the anagogic is the highest mode because it's the mode in which the species dream of itself in a world that, in fact, is the incarnation of its dream. Right? Is the form of literature, not alliterative, but of literature. Or I would say poiesis, right? This Frye, given who he was, concludes from this that the only possible instance of such a thing has to be a religious epic. And so the text he necessarily invokes is Paradise Lost. In distinction from that claim, I would make the argument, I do make the argument elsewhere in the book, that if you do not begin with the notion that the highest element of the dream includes the Godhead as the agency at the center of, or underneath, the totality of what's desired and imagined, then you can look to even texts that some of us may be unhappy with at times, like Virgil's Aeneid, which after all is very much an end of history book of the empire. The empire is presented in that poem as the one reading as the dream of the species. And Virgil then occupies the anagogic position because he's in the margin of that world as it has been dreamt and externalized and yet then re-internalized in the writing of the poem itself. Right? So you really don't need this. And in the long argument of the book, in a way, and I thank Bruce for partially noticing this at least when I was talking about this kind of stuff, but differently at Columbia, noticing that I'm reprising one of the elements of the opening chapter of my Mises. I mean, I said this also at UCLA a while back. The classic distinction in the first chapter of Auerbach's book, of course, is the Greek-Jewish distinction. I'm trying to collapse the distinction down into what can be called in various ways forms of Gnosticism, aspirations for secrets, and I, on the one hand, philosophy, and on the other hand, the monotheistic God, as far as I'm concerned, for the purposes that I'm working with, are the same. So if you think of Diotima's stories at the end of the symposium, to invoke an early classical text, it is not, as many people have said, right? It has this kind of proto-mystical Christian dimension to it. Well, what does that actually mean? How can you unpack that? One of the consequences, Lindsay has left, so I can say this loudly, one of the consequences of that, and I've said it to Ron, and we've been fighting over this, is that you should just forget about Western philosophy, at least since Plato. Lindsay coming back. Yes. I said it just the right second. So I'm trying to collapse that distinction. I'm trying to open up another distinction. One in which the transcendental, I said to Jonathan yesterday, I can sniff the transcendental. One in which the traces of the transcendental are everywhere, and the lived human consequences of the authority of transcendentalism appear. So if you remember from a decade ago, I guess, when I was talking about Simberg's painting in Temple, it couldn't have been this stuff because this is much newer than any of that. But do you know this painting by Simberg? It's to be set over and against Angelus Novus. There's how to describe the painting? There's a scene, absolutely flat Scandinavian barren landscape. There are two, almost a Heideggerian moment. There are two servants, serfs, agricultural workers, whatever you would call them, walking along, carrying with two sticks in each hand a wounded angel. What matters is not only the woundedness of the angel, which you don't hear about, and of course, the Angelus Novus anywhere in Benjamin, that the angel could be wounded. Although at the end of the Auroras of Autumn, the angel was wounded. But in Simberg, the thing that's interesting is the two young men who are carrying this, what should be this ethereal body of a wounded angel, are just so burdened by, yet once again, the cataclysm of this transcendent Gnostic spirit inserting itself, right, in what you could call the labor, the bodiliness, the humanity of suffering. And the young man in the back, in particular, is turned to look at the audience, and the painting is drawn in such a way that anywhere you stand in front of this large canvas, that fatigued, exhausted, tired, mocking look stares you in the eyes. Yet again, the angel. Right? So that's the counterpoint to the Benjaminian side. But there's also there is a strong alternative tradition. And in writing about Adorno's essay on the essay, I'm trying to suggest that the essay, and here we just follow Adorno and Said themselves, the essay is the alternative to the article, it's the alternative to the thesis. It's the alternative to the schema that the academy holds as a model for official culture and the modalities of science and so on and so forth, and the motility and mobility of mind is what's possible in the essay. But then also, a few years ago, maybe now, was it a decade ago? Could it have been a decade ago? I was at Hong Kong, and I was asked to give a paper. I don't remember what the conference was. And we had, not long before that, been in Paris, and we were doing one of the things I always do when I go to Paris, which is I spend a lot of time at the Rembrandts in the Louvre. And I happened to be rereading Benjamin in what was then the New Harvard translation. I came across the Angel of Ruination again, and it just made me cringe, because I look at Rembrandt's Bathsheba in her bath, and I've said this to several people, I cannot say of that it is a ruin. Right? And I know the long history of the Trauerspiel, the Protestant Baroque. Rembrandt is the Protestant Baroque. But then I know, Simon Schama's big book on Rembrandt. A third of the way in, he says, okay, now in order to understand the kind of career Rembrandt wants to make, we need to know that he was studying Rubens, Catholic Baroque, from Rome. And what does Schama do in a way which only Harvard University Press would tolerate? He opens a page and he writes a 250-page book on Rubens inside the book on Rembrandt. And then when he finishes the book on Rubens, he says, okay, now, as I was saying 200 pages earlier, this is what you can say. So there's an enormous amount of strong historical as well as obvious aesthetic and effective evidence that you can't have this universal statement about ruination in any way that stands. And I can understand all the possible narrative accounts that could displace what looks like the real claim of that sentence into some symbolic modality, and I simply am going to throw those away with a profound impatience. Right? We know that he was suffering. We know that he was in crisis. We know that it was despair. We know the crisis of the Middle of Europe at that time. We know the crisis of the Jews, and so on and so on. That image is done, despite the brilliance of its invention and the necessity for its production, it has done a lot of damage. Not only in itself, but by its becoming part of the official schema of culture. So somewhere I quoted in larger book manuscript, I discussed in larger book manuscript a big display at, whichever it was, one of the London museums, of the aesthetics of ruin. Which properly starts out with, the early Romantic creation intentionally of ruins in the German valleys and so on and so forth. And then its transformation into the so-called real cataclysms in which ruin just makes us realize that we don't have to create ruins because there are ruins everywhere if we just look. And that's all we see, is ruin everywhere once we look for it. Well, yeah.
Pardon the crudeness of this, Paul. I'm trying to pull this into a cruder set of categories. So,
Help me be clear.
It seems to me that one reason why you prefer poiesis to messianism redemption is that messianism redemption is kind of secondary and poiesis is primary, like imagination and Wallace Stevens. Yes?
And because of the enormous consequences that follow from the distinction that you're making, which is often masked by official culture.
Okay, and another thing, which may be not quite as parallel, is that you feel that the messianism redemption authorizes intellectuals falsely. It's self-congratulatory to intellectuals who want to adopt a certain role in the world.
I did say somewhat in passing that there is a kind of joyous celebration of desolation.
Right. Now, so one of my questions
that's
is
part of
whether
culture.
poiesis authorizes something.
Yes.
Because it seemed to me that maybe you were going to also like poiesis because what it authorizes is artistic creativity, but not praxis.
No, that's not what I'm going to say. In
Okay.
fact,
I'm glad I asked.
I meant to say, in fact, I would say that all of these things against which I'm trying to agitate are also themselves poetic consequences. So elsewhere in the book, I try to make this point. That, and I have not found a good way to express this. So I'll put it in a specific, it's peculiar to the Benjamin. Benjamin's inventions in 1940 are formidable, right? And I was trying to explain this to Jonathan. We were hammering over the difficulties of expression of this particular problem. What would I like? I would like all of us to imitate, here's one of the dangerous words. I would like all of us to be in the tradition of, another dangerous word, to be inheritors of, to be like, I don't know what that means, Benjamin in the invention. I would like it if none of us felt themselves authorized to repeat the terms that he invented.
That's excellent, but awfully Emerson.
It is terrible, isn't it? That's one of the reasons. I agree, but that's one of the reasons why, of course, to go back to something you asked me 2 years ago at Pittsburgh, Howard Island, one of the Benjamin translators, asked me this question too, and somebody else recently, just to say how Charles Bernstein, on reading some of this stuff, said to me, how are you going to evade the standard American academic nationalist argument that says Stevens achieves these things because he's American? Right, which isn't quite the same question that you asked 2 years ago. It's close enough, right? So I'm not surprised that the hearing of the Emerson, which of course upsets me very much, right? But somewhere else in the book, just glancingly here, there are objections to that Emerson, James, Rorty, Cornell West line, which, to go back to something you, Jonathan, noticed yesterday, is a key term which I didn't mention today, and that is the term in this volume, hope, because I take a very strong stance against the political utility of the category of hope, which needs to be pushed aside because of imbrications, sorry, Joe, for that word, with allegorical and utopian modalities of conceptualization. So on this point, I'm not sure I would say this in June when Cornell's here, but on this point I would be with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Or better yet, to put it in the way I do it in the book, I'm with Thucydides as opposed to Plato. Because in the history, it's the Melian dialogue, right? Which is the question of whether, remember where the Athenian generals say to the Melians, you're totally surrounded, you're outnumbered by thousands to one, we have all the power in the world, surrender. I says, no, we're not going to surrender. It's irrational of you not to surrender. If you don't surrender, we'll kill all of you. If you surrender, some of you will live. Man says, well, we're not going to surrender because we have hope. And the Athenian general launches into this realist account of how foolish it is to have hope because you can't achieve anything. So at the end of the account, hope has its day, and all the Melians are dead. Right? And the Athenians have taken it all. And with no sadness. And the secondary criticism on that passage says, well, at least the Melians had a few more weeks or days of freedom. This is an unreasonable position. Anyways, way too long. Oh, sorry.
Well, given the category at stake, that the poesis of Benjamin is inclined to activate, why do you organize your book around the poesis of Stevens and the misrecognized poesis of Benjamin, and get at the latter by way of a, I think, very powerful critique of the way in which Benjamin has been schematized as an allegoricist? What is the process by means of which that angel of ruination becomes necessary for your imagining of Stevens? Is the necessary angel of Stevens?
That's not the same angel, of course.
I know,
Yes.
I know. But I'm wondering about the process. And it's not dialectical,
No.
but it's mutually animating. I heard in the presentation the way in which the other side of the Benjamin releases the echoes of the Stevens. But how would you describe the process by means of which you have brought those figures together?
It's an extremely good question, and the answers could take many different forms, but I'm going to put it only along one line of thought. I'm going to borrow a word from another section of the book, which I don't think surfaced at all today, and which is a word that Bruce, on reading other sections, has drawn my attention to and tried to draw me on, and that is the question of strength. I use the word strong, right, all the time. This will take a moment. One of the points of reference for me in this context, not ex post facto, formatively over years, is Arendt's remarkable letter to Sholem describing the days up to and the death of Benjamin, which is this remarkable meditation upon Benjamin's unpreparedness to live, which I don't want to confuse with despair. We were saying this earlier. Right? An unpreparedness to live. So to be brutally simple and reductive, as remarkably powerful and inventive as those moments are in 1940 in Paris, in the south of France, and so on. The word I would apply here is this. The words I would apply would be the following. Benjamin's figurations, as brilliant as they are weak. I tried to come up with notions of insufficiency in these comments. The auroras of autumn, which you notice, I'll tell you why I didn't talk about sleep.
But you did.
No, I know, but the real guff on why I didn't do the thing I wanted to do on the credences of summer is because I say in talking about the credence of summer, this is the vestibule to the auroras of autumn. And I turn at some point through the reading of the credences of summer and say, well, now this leads to the auroras of autumn, which is an immensely difficult and complicated text. At which point, I have to talk about the auroras of autumn, right? I don't want to do that. So, yet, because it's a hard problem. So to come back to the problem of anagogies, right, as opposed to allegory. Allegory assumes time which is empty and homogeneous. The allegorist stands in some authorized relationship to a declarative position of style, call it God, or historical materialism if you prefer, right? And then conducts allegoresis upon everything, which is essentially a priestly interpretive mode, the genealogical traces of which cannot be effaced by calling such things as secular messianism. The text, like the auroras of autumn, is, and I can't answer this without talking at length about the poem, which I want to, is stronger. The activity of imagination there, to pick up another point that rose in a couple of comments earlier, can be described simply. The imagination produces its own greatest threats. Right? And the auroras of autumn is the agonistics of imagination encountering its own greatest threats.
I get it. I get it.
So if I had talked about Kermode, one of the things I would have said had I talked about Kermode is Kermode makes two fabulous errors in his essay on Stevens. One of which is he misquotes, not the essay on Stevens, the next essay is on Eliot. He misquotes the last lines substantially of Little Gideon. He just inverts them. And then the other thing is he says, these are the concluding lines of the auroras of autumn. And he quotes the penultimate stanza, which ends with a comma. Right? And if he'd quoted the final stanza, he would have had to go away and start again. You see? So there's something much more demanding. And also, to go back to the question of the gifts, so much more on offer. So I don't know if that answers you. It's the answer to that question. Thank you very much. Sorry I went so long.